The ideal of the Volksstaat, a state of and for the people, was what we would now call a welfare state for Germans with the proper racial pedigree. In one of his central pronouncements, Hitler promised the creation of a socially just state, a model society that would continue to eradicate all social barriers. Compared with today's standards in the West, Germans back in the early 1930s weren't exactly swimming in luxury. It was the Great Depression, unemployment was high, and food, drink and tobacco consumption ate up to 50% of a household's income, with another 12% going on rent and 5% on utility bills. After taxes, this didn't leave them with much disposable income. But then Hitler came along and created a welfare state in the Third Reich using several organisations and numerous policies. The National Socialists implemented a closed economy, autarky, with wage controls, price controls, rent controls, a progressive taxation system, corporate taxes, deficit spending, child support and household subsidies, and a social health service. They supplemented the price of coal, food and other goods for the people. They redistributed wealth from the rich and gave that wealth to the poor, and used the NSV, the National Socialist People's Welfare Organisation, and others to aid the poor, pregnant women and the youth. And a social safety net was erected. In an effort to rapidly advance their generous social welfare programs, the Nazis banned all private welfare institutions so that the government could control the distribution of welfare benefits and thereby socially engineer society. These social welfare programs were a Hitlerian effort to place the community above the individual and advance the well-being of all citizens. As Hitler told a reporter in 1934, he was determined to give Germans the highest possible standard of living. Supplemental benefit payments for rent, insurance, coal, potatoes, and other daily needs were paid out with minimal bureaucratic delay. The state offered household assistance to families with large numbers of children. It also provided money for special expenditures, such as dental bills or children's education costs. Tackling unemployment was Hitler's first priority after seizing power. In fact, in his first radio address after taking power, delivered on the 1st of February 1933, he declared that unemployment had to be overcome within a few years. There were 6 million people unemployed, with 2 out of every 5 Germans out of work in the winter of 1932 to 33. Most of these were male and below the age of 25. To deal with the immediate problem, Hitler declared that no one shall suffer from hunger and cold, and set up a new organisation, the Winter Relief Charity. The aim was to provide coal and garments sufficient to keep a household fairly warm and decently clothed, to supply a bit more food, to distribute Christmas dinners, trees and children's toys, and the beloved Yuletide. It even promised to step in and relieve unexpected accidents and misfortunes for which the victim were in no wise to blame. Then various work creation schemes were introduced by the Reich Commissar for Labour, Gunter Gericke, and these soaked up 630,000 workers by March 1934. A capped 40-hour work week was introduced, and overtime was banned, all to encourage the take-up of further employees. They also cooked the books, like our politicians do today, by removing some of the long-term unemployed as well as the women from the registers. They also substituted and created volunteer employment for certain groups, like the youth, to keep them out of the registers. This included the Landhilfe, or the Land Aid Programme, which was established in mid-1933 and run by the Reichsarbeitsdienst, the Reich Labour Service, or RAD. 16 to 21-year-olds, both male and female, had to spend 6 months on the farms, where they were given bed and board as well as some pocket money. And it was voluntary, but if you didn't sign up, you'd lose your unemployment pay. The Hitler Youth ran a similar scheme called the Landdienst, Land Service, which operated in the summer months but also included military-style training. And it wasn't just the youth or the farms that had this. Hitler introduced a compulsory labour service for adults in 1935, and this later became partially militarised. A workbook was introduced in February 1935, which meant that workers, now known as followers or Gefolgschaft, had to get permission from the state-run labour exchange in order to change jobs. And the state leaders of the businesses, the Betriebsführer, also had to get a permit to hire the workers they wanted. As mandated by the government, employers had to give 4 weeks' notice before they could fire an employee. The employee then had 2 months to appeal the dismissal, and although it's not explicitly stated in the sources that I have, the evidence implies that the DAF, the State Trade Union, or German Labour Front, was the one overseeing the appeal process. As for workplace misconduct, workers' councils were set up to regulate business practices, working hours and wages, disciplining both employers and workers. In 1 year alone in 1934, over 50 workers were dismissed, while 13 employers had their businesses confiscated. These courts of social honour, Sociale Gerichte, were established according to law to prevent owners and managers from the abuse of their position of power in the firm having maliciously exploited the workers or insulted their honour. And it turns out that the National Socialists nationalised over 500 large German companies, just as Mussolini nationalised 3/4 of the Italian economy. I've been over the false narrative of the so-called privatisation of the German economy in previous videos, so I won't dwell on that here. But in a nutshell, the privatisation narrative is based on one English newspaper that simply got it wrong, and people have repeated the lie since then without actually looking at what happened in Germany. One of the first acts of the Nazi regime was to dissolve the old labour unions and merge them into a single organisation under state control. This, however, was not a mere Nazi one big union. Precisely as the Nazis did in agriculture, so they here coordinated everybody connected with industry into a huge vertical trust. The lowliest workman and the biggest manufacturer became, at least technically, fellow members of the new Labour Front, and the white-collar workers were likewise in the same boat. Here, as elsewhere, we note the underlying principle of the Third Reich. The classless state mobilised for collective aims in accordance with the slogan Gemeinnutz for Eigennutz, the common weal above individual advantage. This was a dictatorship of the German proletariat. On the 22nd of June 1938, under the 4-year plan, the Third Reich introduced a new labour conscription where the state now assigned where the individual German should work. Worker battalions were created, armed with spades, and at least one of these, possibly more, fought at the Battle of Arnhem in 1944, initially part of Kampfgruppe Spindler. Interestingly, historians are unsure how to interpret these facts, often contradicting primary source evidence. It was an unpopular system, both with the farms, who had to take the new workforce on, and with the mainly urban youth who took part. I heard few criticisms of the labour service for young men, even in quarters strongly anti-Nazi in most respects. However, I encountered much criticism of the young women's branch of the service, in some instances rising to severe condemnation. In Nazi eyes, since a national labour service should be truly universal, Germany's young womanhood is logically included in the general scheme. In practice, however, labour service for women was not generalised until the outbreak of the present war. The basic idea behind the women's labour service is the same as that for their brothers. Girls of all social classes live and work together, learning the value and dignity of labour, and of course becoming ardent Nazis in the process. And it's often said that the National Socialists froze or reduced wages, and this is used to then claim that they were against the workers, thus rah-rah communism. However, in a recession or depression, which they were in, both prices and wages naturally come down, as I've explained in my video on what causes recessions and depressions. During the early 1930s, the Nazis froze wages to prevent them from declining further, not to prevent them from going up. From the start, wages were set high, overtime pay was generous, and dismissal of workers by employers was difficult to execute. But inflation and stricter labour laws eroded much of that advantage. It was only later in 1938, when inflation was becoming a problem, that the cap on hourly wages became detrimental. However, they started to raise it, and did increase the workday from 8 to 10 hours, and in some exceptional cases 14, which they had previously capped, and allowing workers to work longer hours and thus get paid more for that. But either way, they're controlling the maximum hours worked and the wages, showing that this was a state-run welfare economy that, at least, attempted to benefit the workers. Vacations were an unknown ideal for most people, and me, prior to the Third Reich, but that changed when Hitler came along. Thanks to the DAF, the German workers' vacation time almost doubled from 12 days to 21 days if you had been with the company for 10 years. Then, the Strength Through Joy program, the KDF, which was part of the German Labour Front, provided affordable leisure activities that included holidays abroad and, in Germany, parks, ocean cruises, worker canteens, subsidised meals, factory libraries and gardens, sports facilities, swimming pools, spas, summer resorts, adult education courses, orchestras during lunch breaks, tickets to concerts and operas, gymnasiums and sport training facilities. The Labour Front secretary tries to increase his popularity and I have to pay for it. Last year, he compelled me to spend over 100,000 marks for a new lunchroom in our factory. This year, he wants me to build a new gymnasium and athletic field, which will cost about 120,000 marks. Now, I have nothing against sports, but as a matter of fact, the workers nowadays don't care much for sports or things of that kind. They work 10, 11 or 12 hours daily, at least 60 hours a week, and they complain they never get enough rest. More often than not, they take a nap during their lunch hour. Really, no worker is interested in the gymnasium and athletic field. Yet I shall have to build it in order to satisfy the Labour Front secretary. 10.3 million Germans had signed up to the DAF subsidised vacations by 1938, and the DAF even built ocean liners for its members. These were not cheap either. 6 steamers were in use by the time that the war began, but an entire fleet had been planned. This is the most gigantic scheme of organised, state-directed entertainment that the world has ever seen. Every member of the Labour Front can participate, from high-paid executives to day labourers, from women secretaries to servant girls. Conversely, no one outside the Labour Front can share its benefits. By the beginning of the war in 1939, participants in KDF trips came to 45 million. Which included 31.5 million excursionists, 6 million hikers, 0.7 million cruises aboard the KDF fleet, and other activities. To the Nazis, cheap vacations were regarded as a way to break the travel privilege of the bourgeois. They touted it as the centerpiece of what they called socialism of deed. Worker conditions were improved under the beautification of labour policy of the DAF. Ugly factories were torn down, new, more updated ones were erected, bad lighting and plumbing was fixed, dirt, smoke and other things were cleaned up or improved, restrooms, lunchrooms, locker rooms, swimming pools, shower rooms and washrooms were created, and hot meals were served. As difficulties mount, the activities and organisations of the Labour Front multiply. In every German factory there are Labour Front secretaries, committees and auxiliaries, sections of a huge, top-heavy bureaucratic machine. The Nazis also abolished income not earned by work and toil, and distinguished between rapacious and productive capital. The Nazis reduced the number of stock exchanges from 21 to 9 in 1935, and after a bunch of laws passed in 1934, 38, 39 and 40, people in debt were protected from capitalist creditors. These measures prevented repossessions or the taking of wages earned from working overtime or vacation pay, Christmas bonuses, child rearing allowances and pensions. Then the Public Works Corporation was created and specialised in building social housing. Somehow, Adam Tooze in The Wages of Destruction makes the claim that housing was privatised and that public funds for housing construction were reduced. I can only assume that as a statist he mistakenly believes that all corporations are private, and thus he's ignoring the state-run German Public Works Corporation. Also, some of the housing came under the Public Health Service, as housing was deemed important to the health of the race, so maybe there's a mix-up there, Mr. Tooze. In reality, there were subsidies paid to house owners, and builders provided 50% of the cost of a house conversion and 80% of the cost for house repair. This government-controlled sector resulted in a doubling of house building and repair between 1932 and 1934. Now, it was still less than what it had been before the Great Depression, so it wasn't particularly successful overall because socialism doesn't work, but the point is that the government was fanning the flames. Taxes were so high on the rich and the corporations that in some cases they were based on revenue, not on profit. There was one tax levied against German property owners that required they pay 10 years of taxes in advance in one lump sum. Industrialists complained that some 80 to 90% of business profits were being siphoned off by the state. This figure is clearly exaggerated, but it speaks volumes about the Nazi government's basic tax policy orientation. In fact, in the one instance where the government actually did reduce taxes, the industry in question boomed. The motor industry was helped by a series of tax concessions on private and business purchases, which dragged the industry out of the recession faster than any other. When Hitler decreed that every German worker should have an affordable car at 990 Reichsmarks per vehicle, or $396 in 1938, the private sector said that such a car could not be built that cheap. So Hitler said that the state would build it instead and put the DAF in charge. Through payroll deduction, the DAF subsidised the Volkswagen, the people's car. However, when the war began, it had to abandon the project, so no cars were actually delivered until after the war, which is when the Beetle, as it was then called, became incredibly popular. That said, there were many other Volks projects, not just the people's car. There was the people's radio, the people's apartments, the people's refrigerators, the people's tractors, the people's gramophone, the people's motorbike, and the people's sewing machines. All this was done to help the poor, not the rich, as was their socialized health service. The treatment given a tuberculous patient is partly determined by his social worth. If he is a valuable citizen and his case is curable, no expense is spared. If he is adjudged incurable, he is kept comfortable, of course, but no special effort is made to prolong slightly an existence which will benefit neither the community nor himself. Germany can nourish only a certain amount of human life at a given time. We National Socialists are in duty bound to foster individuals of social and biological value. The headquarters for the Public Health Service was in Berlin near Nollendorfplatz and was headed by a Dr. Eckart. There was a health insurance law which meant that the poorest people in society got access to medical treatment, and the hospitals were coordinated, Gleichschaltung, and were nationalized. Patients have the right to choose the doctor or surgeon they wish to consult, and they even have the right to be sent to the private hospitals of such medical men, if he customarily sends his patients to those institutions. Dr. Schramm took me to the hospital of which he was chief surgeon. It was a fairly large private institution with about 150 beds. Some wards were for insured patients. I spoke with several of them. They were all working men. Their health insurance allowed them up to 1 year's hospitalisation with pocket money. After that, if not cured, I was told they were taken care of out of the public health funds indefinitely. Later, perhaps the most significant point was the cheapness with which the clinic was conducted. I was shown the cost sheets and found that the average charge made for patients to their associations was less than $1 a day. Which doesn't make sense. How can you only charge $1 per day per patient? How are the doctors going to get paid from that? How much are you paying the nurses? How are you buying new equipment? Right? Clearly, Stoddard wasn't showing the full picture, and that they must have been getting funding from the state, which proves that these are not private institutions, as they had been coordinated, Gleichschaltung, into the state, which he has already admitted. And, just like in every place where a welfare state is implemented, the economy suffered. The quantity of Reichsbank notes doubled between 1933 and 1939, it doubled again between 1941 and 1944, and doubled again in 1945. The National Socialists implemented price controls to try and prevent that rise, and I've been over this before with the Vampire Economy by Gunther Reimann going into detail with first-hand account testimony. But there's another source that I haven't mentioned before this video, and that is Stoddard's Into the Darkness. Now, Stannard was an American journalist who visited Germany during the winter of 1939 to 1940, so he only witnessed the German economy during the beginning of the war. So some of what he wrote is obviously influenced by that, but some of the stuff he observed had been implemented before the war, because we've seen that before. So let's read some more of what he wrote. 3 important pieces of legislation were passed shortly after the Nazis came to power. They were 1. The National Food Estate, 2. The Hereditary Farmlands Law, 3. The Market Control Statute. The Food Estate is a gigantic quasi-public corporation embracing in its membership not only all persons immediately on the land, but also everyone connected with the production and distribution of foodstuffs. Large landowners, small peasants, agricultural labourers, millers, bakers, canners, middlemen, right down to local butchers and grocers. They are on and all included in this huge vertical trust. The aim is to bring all these groups' interests, previously working largely at cross purposes, into a harmonious, coordinated whole, concerned especially with problems of production and distribution. The Market Control Statute links all this with the consumer. The aim here is a thoroughgoing, balanced economic structure based on the principle known as the just price. Everybody is supposed to make a profit, but none are to be out of line with the others. Furthermore, the ultimate consumer is to be protected from profiteering. A member of the Old Guard, Josef Wagner, was appointed Price Commissar. He has a huge administrative staff at his disposal and keeps in close touch with the police to ensure the effectiveness of his decisions. His job is to fix both wholesale and retail prices for raw materials as well as for finished goods. It is the duty of the price commissar to see that a stable price level is maintained. Price increases are forbidden, and in many cases reductions are not allowed. These aren't the only contemporary sources saying that stable prices were the objective, with Naumann's Behemoth saying it too. So yes, they're aiming for a just price, they're protecting people from profiteering, and they're controlling the entire economy from butchers and grocers all the way to large landowners and everyone in between. And this was all done before the war, not just during the war, but actually in the 1933 to 1935 period. It really does sound exactly like what the proponents of the welfare state would call for today. And before you say, but the workers weren't in charge, yes they were. After dinner, the head of the local Bauernschaft, or peasants' organisation, came to pay his respects and talk over the trip planned for the next day. Like most of these officials, he was an obvious countryman. The Bauernschaft is really run by dirt farmers. And here is Richard Walter Darry, Reich Minister of Food and Agriculture, on the subject. Our food cards constitute merely the last link in an economic chain which we were forging long before the war. This chain extends from farm grower to consumer, with stable prices all along the line. The food card is the final act of the whole carefully worked out process, ensuring to each citizen his share of food, no matter what the size of his income. And in addition to prices for goods and services, they also froze rents. Now, they failed at fixing prices because it's impossible to do that. Even if they did succeed for a short time, it led to shortages and other oddities, and ultimately it hurt them more than it helped. But the point is that they tried to do these things to help the people. And this is the exact goals that the Keynesians have as well. The reason why we have central banks is to have stable prices, right? Well, the Keynesians got their economics from the National Socialist economists, and both shared in the same goal of a centrally managed economy. By 1939, at the beginning of the war, prices had risen merely 9% in 6 years, which in modern terminology would be called remarkable stability. Of course, the German economy was no longer a market system, but a command order organised for war. Symptoms of excess demand made their first appearance in 1937. Shortages developed in a number of consumer goods, especially in meats and dairy products. Long waiting lists appeared for many items of housing construction and for tools and dyes that were needed in the armament industries.
Goering himself said this in August 1937. A shortage of a whole range of consumer goods is already evidenced today in daily life. A British magazine reported in May 1939, so a few months before the war began, food shortage and signs of inflation are not the most serious indications of the excessive strain to which the Reich's national economy has been subjected during the last few years. And 2 months into the war, Goebbels writes this in his diary. There's a host of problems with the economy and food supplies.
Anyone who went through the lockdowns in 2020 might have experienced the phenomena where you go to the shop, but there's nothing in the shop to buy. Here where I live, there was nothing in the supermarkets except for some beans, a particular brand of beer with the same name as the virus because people are stupid, and some charcoal toothpaste. So we had this odd situation where we had currency units in our pockets, but then nothing to spend them on. Well, the same thing happened in the Reich. Just like in 2020, the state, at least here in the UK, which does manipulate prices by the way, kept the prices artificially too low, which meant that people went out and bought all the goods, resulting in shortages.
Possession of cards is no guarantee that the articles covered by them can always be bought. Articles technically card-free are effectively rationed because they must all be bought in small quantities, so even persons with plenty of money can never get much ahead of their immediate needs. Also, one is never sure of being able to buy anything, because it may suddenly be temporarily or even permanently sold out. To a foreigner, this sort of existence soon becomes maddening. The gradual impoverishment of the people was accompanied by a rapid growth of savings that were generally mistaken for rising personal wealth. After all, everyone could watch his bank balance grow steadily, promising better living conditions in the future.
But it's a sham. Currency is worthless if you have nothing to exchange it for. If everyone's bank balance grows at the same time, that's either an indication of shortages or a build-up of future inflation. And that's precisely what occurred in the Reich, although they didn't enter hyperinflation until 1945. But to pay for the war, the bureaucrats suggested tax increases, which Goebbels, Goering and Hitler rejected. In fact, they reinstated overtime pay for 9 hours and over in August 1940 and exempted taxation on night, holiday, Sunday pay and Christmas bonuses. The farmers were granted billions in price subsidies, with payments increasing by 25 to 35% over the course of the war. And in 1941, the government also raised pensions by an average of about 15%, and mandatory health insurance was also introduced. So pensions and health insurance were government run. Many tax hike proposals, especially on the poor, were simply shot down by the government leadership, and as explained in Gott Ali's Hitler's Beneficiaries, the lower income Germans benefited the most from this type of economy. They were able to pay off their mortgages and loans, and those who lost their homes in the bombings received household belongings from the state, taken from deported Jews, and the tax burden, even during the war, remained on the corporations, landlords, and the well-off.
For all those who legally belonged to the German racial community, about 95% of the population, social divides became ever smaller. For many people, the regime's aim of levelling out class distinctions was realised in the Hitler Youth, the National Labour Service, the major party organisations, and ultimately even in the Wehrmacht. The goal of reducing class differences also motivated the Nazis to launch, between 1939 and 1942, a series of increasingly ambitious plans to settle Germans in Eastern Europe. Designed to give Germans more living space, greater access to natural resources, and better opportunities for self-advancement, the most extreme proposal envisioned forcibly relocating 50 million Slavs to Siberia.
A counter-argument to the idea that there was a National Socialist welfare state might be that there was no equality among Germans. After all, it was the aim of the National Socialists to remove women from the workforce and replace them with men, right? Well, the problem is that more women actually entered the workforce than left it. The number of women in commercial and industrial employment went from 5.1 million in 1933 to 6.5 million in 1938. and the total employment of women across the whole of the economy went from 11.4 million in 1933 to 14.8 million in 1939.
Most women who were registered as unemployed in 1932 found their way back into the workforce after 1933, not into the kitchen. Indeed, the number of women in employment was high by comparison with other industrial economies.
Nobody was putting a gun to these women's heads and saying that they should or shouldn't work. So what's actually going on here? Well, first, because their wages were lower than men's, it was discovered that a lot of women were actually employed during the Great Depression, whereas it was mostly men who were out of work. In a lot of cases, the wives were working and the husbands were the ones out of work. And this proves, once again, that wages are affected by supply and demand. And if wages are kept artificially higher, employers can't take more workers on, and so they don't, increasing unemployment. It turns out that setting a minimum wage or demanding equality of pay actually hurts marginalized groups, such as minorities and women. This is why politicians are pushing for such policies, because they want to hurt those groups, even if they lie and say that they're actually for those groups. Secondly, more women entered the workforce, even though there was massive financial encouragement for them not to do so. Marriage loans were granted to women to leave the labour market, and the state cancelled a part of these loans for each child that was born. Child support and household subsidies increased by 25% in 1939, 28% in 1940, 56% in 1941, and 96% in 1942. Wives of Wehrmacht soldiers were receiving nearly double what the families of American and British soldiers were receiving at the time, a clear indication that this was a welfare state.
As a matter of course, family maintenance payments were tax-free, and recipients were exempt from consultation charges under their health insurance. As a result of these handouts, working-class women could suddenly afford to give up their factory jobs.
And yet, they didn't. More women entered the workforce than left it. So misogynistic was the regime that male bachelors actually had taxes imposed upon them, punishing them for not being married. The National Socialists effectively rewarded women for staying at home and punished single men for working, and even in that scenario, more women entered the workforce. Women also made up more than 16% of the National Socialist Party members in 1939, with 2 million women in the National Socialist Women's League in 1938, the equivalent of over 40% of the party's leadership.
Hitler's government began to ease conditions for single mothers from 1933, when tax changes both gave them relief on earnings to help to maintain a child and exempted them from marriage loan taxation. It was cautious, however, because toleration of illegitimacy had been promoted by the KPD and was denounced by conservatives and the churches.
So it was the conservatives and the churches who had been against single motherhood, not the National Socialists or the Communists. Hess announced in December 1939 that the Nazi Party would assume guardianship of illegitimate children whose fathers had perished in the war because
the highest service a woman can render to the community is a gift of racially healthy children for the survival of the nation.
Women with illegitimate children whose partners died in the war could apply for a post-mortem marriage and draw from the widow's pension. Free theatre tickets were given by the Darmstadt local authority to mothers with at least 3 children, and mothers of 3 or more children were also given honour cards, with shops forced to give them preferential treatment, such as allowing them to jump queues. The NSV offered food and clothing to families of new mothers worth 2,000 Reichsmarks, and other Nazi women's organisations ran courses on modern childcare. 1.7 million women had attended them by March 1939 out of a female population of 30 million.
Aware of the need to provide welfare and other kinds of support, particularly for married women workers with children, the German Labour Front, the Nazi successor to the old trade unions, put increasing pressure on employers to provide day nurseries for the young children of female workers and to regulate house and conditions of women workers so that their health could not suffer. So, while some historians and Marxist feminists still push this narrative that women were oppressed more than men in the Reich, the reality is somewhat different to that. As a woman historian who wrote the book Women in Nazi Germany, Jill Stephenson states that Marxist feminists have argued that National Socialist policies forced women to bear children for the men. But it turns out that the German women were not forced to bear children by the German men. And this wasn't actually a regime of force. The people went over to the National Socialists willingly because they were popular due to the welfare state they created. There were only 7,000 members of the Gestapo in 1937, including their secretaries. So even if they had wanted to force all the women to have babies, there's no way they could actually have practically done that. And since the evidence contradicts the Marxist feminist narrative, and we know that if we have a contradiction that means we got something wrong, let's think of an alternative way of interpreting this evidence that might actually explain it better. Just as a thought experiment. Let's pretend for a second that the National Socialists weren't against women, but were actually pro-women. Let's pretend that instead of forcing women to do one thing or another, they gave them the freedom to make their own choices. If they wanted to be in the factories, they could, which is why we see more women enter the workforce. But if they wanted to be mothers, then they could, which is why some women chose that option too. And since Hitler needs children in order to do Lebensraum, living space in the East, as well as to ensure the survival of the German race, he also wants to encourage both men and women to have children. So they punished men for not having babies and offered financial and social incentives for both men and women who chose to start families and have kids. Therefore, rather than be against women, they were actually just pro-children. But even then, nobody was forcing them to have children. They were just encouraged to do so. And we see this in the statistics. When compared to other countries, these policies didn't actually improve the birth rate. Socialism doesn't work. Yes, it increased after 1933, but it also increased in many other countries around the world since the worst years of the Depression had passed. By the late 1930s, it was clear that loan-aided couples were no more likely than others to have large families. This was hardly surprising, with 84% of loan applicants coming from poorer families. Thus, even the National Socialists could not hold the trend towards two-child marriages. The birth rate is evidence that, however hard the Nazis tried to encourage large families, women were not forced to bear children. As I said, rather than be against women, the National Socialists are actually just pro-children. Not only does all the evidence now fit with such an interpretation, but it'll also annoy all the Redditors on r/bad history, and that to me is just a cherry on the cake. And I was tempted to go into more depth about women in National Socialist Germany, but I think I'll do a dedicated video on that subject in the future because some of Hitler's speeches on this are really revealing, and there's also Himmler's polygamy farms to discuss as well. So we'll come back to that. Thus, the National Socialists of the Third Reich had a welfare state. It actually sounds a lot like the modern United Kingdom, which isn't surprising considering that the National Socialists were socialists just like the Labour Party and the Conservatives are, and that John Maynard Keynes got his economics from the National Socialists. However, I'm sure there will be people saying that I've somehow got this all wrong, or that all the evidence I've presented can be dismissed because they always say that, no matter how many books I use. So I'm curious to see what people say about this, and let me know in the comments below. Oh, and also check out these other videos on the National Socialist economy right here. Thanks for watching, bye for now.